Okay, good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to take this off for the moment. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, both online and in person, to today's talk, which has been organized by the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies here at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies offers content-based language learning opportunities, various opportunities for students to study abroad and to conduct content-based research in Russian abroad, and numerous other exciting ways to professionalize your interest in Russian. And I can go on ad nauseum about that, so I'll stop here. But for those of you who I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Sarah Bidgood, and I direct the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program just over the way at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And we are delighted to have with us here today Professor Sam Greene, who is a professor of Russian politics and director of the Russian Institute at King's College London. Professor Greene is the co-author of Putin versus the People, The Perilous Politics of a Divided Russia, which was brought out by Yale University Press in 2019. And although this is the first time we're meeting in person and an example of the kind of small world phenomenon, Professor Greene's co-author on that book was my professor at the University of North Carolina in a previous life. So it feels like a kismet that we're meeting here in Monterey. Professor Greene's work focuses on the relationships of power in Russia, in authoritarianism, and in societies that are experiencing social, economic, and political transformation. And in this work, he focuses in particular on social media as a factor for social and political mobilization. So his remarks here today, which are entitled The Informational Dictator's Dilemma, Citizen Responses to Media Censorship, Cooptation, a Marginalization in Russia and Belarus, I'm sure we'll touch upon all of these different themes. So Sam, we're really honored to have you with us here today. Thank you for making the time to join us, and the floor is yours.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna take this off as well. I learned to teach in a mask, but I hate doing this. So, and I'm not here to teach. So I'm taking the mask off. Thank you, Sarah, for the very kind introduction, and for the opportunity to be here. And thank you to all of you, both in the room, and when I look in this direction, I'm also looking at the people who are online. So just pretend I'm. So it is. It's a pleasure to get to actually be in rooms with people again. Actually, I feel like we keep saying that. But so I'm going to talk about some ideas having to do with censorship, with authoritarianism, with politics in authoritarianism. It'll touch as we get towards the end a little bit on the war and on things that have happened in the last couple of months, but it's not specifically about that. But I think when we get to the Q&A, and I'm going to try to talk for maybe somebody keep me honest on the time, maybe for 30, maybe 35 minutes or so, just to get some ideas out there. But then I'm very happy for the conversation after that to range into whatever anybody wants to talk about. I think I don't think I'm alone in this. So many of the conversations we're having these days, for those of us who work sort of in the Russia and post-Soviet space, have just turned into group therapy sessions, right? And that's just where we are as human beings and where we are as a discipline, as a field. So I'm happy and grateful for the opportunity to have another one of those with all of you here. So start with maybe not start with some context. Generally understood, right, that autocrats, people running authoritarian countries, like to control the media. One question is why, and I'll get to that in a moment, but the question at the heart of the research I'm going to present and talk about now is more about the question of how, right? I've actually kind of got these in reverse order up on the screen, because classically when we think about how autocrats and authoritarian regimes control the media, we think about coercion and censorship, right? We think about a regime saying, there's certain things that you're not going to talk about, right? That we're not going to allow you to talk about, that beyond the pale. And if you do that, right, then here's the fist of the state to come down on you. That's very jarring, Heaven. Okay, is there anything to make that go away? Okay, well, I'll just try to ignore it. Right, so the idea is that there's certain things you can't say, right, and then there's punishments for saying it. Right? More recently, however, we've seen regimes focus on a different strategy, right? On strategies of cooptation and persuasion, right? That what we're seeing autocrats do is work with the people who control the media, who publish the media, particularly in more diversified media environments, right, where you have the internet, but also as we've seen authoritarianism take hold or reestablish itself in countries that have been through some kind of liberalizing transition. Right? So you think about Russia, but also large parts of Central and Eastern Europe, right, where you have nominally private, or at least largely private media sectors, right, where you begin to see the regime establishing certain kinds of relationships with publishers, owners, journalists, editors, right, to encourage them, right, and persuade them to put out certain kinds of messages and to suppress other kinds of messages, right? So we know that both of these strategies are out there, right? And we seem to be seeing, despite the fact there's been all of this research and literature focusing on the cooptation and persuasion strategies, we actually seem to be seeing an emergent shift towards harsher tactics, particularly in the country that I spend most of my time studying in Russia. So we want to understand, or one of the things I wanted to understand is what's the impact of that? How should we think about that? About both why it's happening and what kind of effect it's likely to have. And in fact, we don't, as social scientists, have a really, or as policymakers, have a really good understanding of which of these two strategies is more effective. Right? From an autocrat's point of view, right? We don't like putting ourselves in autocrat's shoes, but we have to, right, as analysts, as policymakers. So we don't really understand what works. Right? We don't really understand very much about, again, how effective these two kinds of strategies are, right? For the academics in the room, right, there's been this growing theory of what Sergei Guriev at Sciences Po in Paris, formerly of the New Economic School, and Russia's economist Daniel Treisman out at UCLA, political scientist, talk about in terms of informational autocracy. Right? I borrowed that term for the title of the talk. Right? And what they've really done is to focus on sort of this presumed preference for persuasion over coercion. We seem to be seeing a little more autocrats go for this sort of softer tactic of cooptation and persuasion, and trying to understand again the impact that has, why autocrats may go in that direction. And they distinguish between, this is the book that just came out, I think last month, very much worth reading. If you're interested, they distinguish between sort of two kinds of dictatorships, right? Fear dictatorships and spin dictatorships. And again, our classical sense of how dictatorship works really is very much in the fear camp, right? So we think about dictatorships that have a lot of coercion, a lot of repression, using the resources of the state, right? Particularly law enforcement resources, military resources, to go ahead and punish people for stepping out of line, right? And it's not just that they're violently repressive; it's that this violence is done out in the open. It's done where people can see it, because the purpose of that violence and that repression is not simply to punish people, right? But actually to encourage people to behave, right? So what you're trying to do is produce fear. Right? If you want to produce fear, you need people to believe that if they step over a certain red line, right, that they're going to get hit pretty hard. Right? This then, on the censorship front, right, tends to be accompanied by very comprehensive censorship, right? So total control, or pretty much entirely total control, at least of the formal media environment. Most dictatorships and sort of classical authoritarian systems, and even totalitarian systems, have some degree of underground media, right? But at least in that, which in the formal media sector, right, total control, nothing allowed to operate outside of that control, right? And again, the censorship, like the repression, is overt, it's public, it's out there in the open for people to see, because again, what you're trying to do is to produce compliance, right? By making it very clear where the red lines are. Often there's an official ideology that goes along with this, although not always, right? So we see this in systems that aren't totalitarian, that are just authoritarian, right? That don't necessarily have an ideology behind it, but there is a very strong propaganda element to it, right? So it's not just about preventing certain messages from coming through, but about imposing other messages, among which, right, is a rejection of democracy as such. So often these kinds of fear dictatorships don't talk about themselves in democratic terms. They don't talk about themselves as sort of organic parts of a global liberalized system, right? So what Greene and Treisman do is to contrast this with what they call spin dictatorships. This overlaps with a lot of what you may have read and come across in terms of hybrid authoritarian regimes, hybrid democracies. There's all these kinds of hyphenated regime types that political scientists like to invent, right? But they operate on a very different kind of logic, right? There tends to be little violent repression, and what violence there is concealed. It's about creating compliance by projecting consensus rather than by projecting fear. So what you're trying to do is to convince the public that you are, as a dictator, first of all, that you're actually democratically elected. So most of these regimes tend to hold elections and try to at least portray the idea that they're free and fair, right? They try to project an image of themselves as competent, right? It's producing welfare for the people and governing in the interests of the majority of the population, right? And they allow for some degree of diversity in media systems, in civil society, sometimes on the political spectrum. As a result of which they conduct the censorship that they still need, right, in order to maintain this image and really to keep. It's still an authoritarian system, right? So the playing field for those who would contest elections, for example, is still very much off balance. Right? You want to keep the coercion hidden. You want to keep it in the background so that people aren't aware of the fact that they're being coerced into this political arrangement, or at least because people do tend to be pretty much aware of how things work. You don't want it to be in the forefront of people's minds, right? You want people to believe that they're operating in this, again, in this environment of consensus. And that's true both in the way that they manage sort of coercion and law enforcement, but also true in the way that they manage censorship, right? So it's done through more subtle relationships. It's done by cooptation again and persuasion. Right? This overlaps a bit with an argument that Graham Robertson, as Sarah was mentioning a moment ago, and I made in this book. And I'm going to do a very unusual thing, and I'm not going to plug the book actually, because it's about to be issued as a paperback a little bit later this year, updated to include the book. So don't buy it yet. Go and buy it in September, or pre-order it now, actually, which will make the press for you. But the argument here is this idea that Graham and I talk about as co-construction. Right? This idea that, in fact, power in authoritarian regimes, particularly the kinds of authoritarian regimes that Greene and Treisman are describing, these softer kinds of regimes, is co-construction. It's not entirely imposed by dictators from the top down, right? But that it is built with the participation of millions and tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people from the bottom up. Right? It's important for leaders, right, to be seen as popular. And one of the ideas behind both sort of our argument and Greene and Treisman's argument is that it's in fact easier and cheaper and less risky, right, to rule as a spin dictator than as a fear dictator. Because whenever you've got violence involved, right, there's always the potential of getting that violent calculation wrong. And you think about when we've seen autocrats fall around the world, whether it's Mubarak or Gaddafi or Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014, right? They do something, right? Some kind of attempt to suppress violently a popular uprising, right? And that backfires. It just makes people angrier, right? And they end up losing control of the street and losing control of the state in the process, right? So if you are somebody like Putin, or at least how we used to think about Putin until very, very recently, as a spin dictator, then what you want to do, right, is to be seen as very, very popular among the population, right, in order to project that control both to the population, but also to your elite, right, to the people sort of the commanding heights of the political and economic hierarchy. If they think that you're popular, you become much harder to challenge. It gives them other incentives to play along as well, right? And this operates through a system of very powerful social incentives that people living in these societies face, right? First among which is this idea that difference really is not legitimate, right? So even though we're mimicking a democracy, and even though we've got elections that we're claiming are free and fair, right? We're also claiming that the person in charge, in this case Putin, right, is always winning something like 70% of the vote, and you're always getting 70% turnout. And if you happen to be in Chechnya, then you get about 136% of the vote on about 120% turnout, right? So you're projecting this idea that if you disagree, right, you're not just, not happy with the people in power, right, but you're sort of out of step with society as a whole, right? And that can be deeply stigmatized, right? So for many people, it's important to sort of minimize social friction, right, and sort of lubricate the interactions of their lives by projecting that look, I understand how things in society work. I understand where the consensus is, and because I need to tell you that I'm a normal human being, right? We don't really have a great word for this, but in English, but the word in Russian is adekvat, right? The idea that I have a sense, right, of how to operate in this society, a society that can have a lot of risk, that can have sometimes not quite enough social trust. Right? The way I make myself look trustworthy and look like somebody who you can deal with, right, is by showing that I adhere to mainstream views and attitudes, or at least what the media are telling me are mainstream views and attitudes. Emotions also matter. We can come back to this actually in the context of the war. One of the things we talked about in the book is this massive rally around the flag that Russia experienced after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which really kept Putin's approval ratings up at this sort of 86% stratospheric level, right, for the better part of 4 years. But again, that's not a vertical thing. Right? That's a horizontal relationship. That's a relationship of emotional attachment among Russian citizens, not between an individual Russian citizen and Putin, not between a citizen and the state, but between millions of Russians who now are felt for that period of time. And it's an open question whether they're feeling this now in the context of this expanded war, right? But feel the sense of emotional and political community at that point associated with pride and hope, right? As a result of this extraordinary thing that happened in the life of the country. But behind all of this, right, creating all of this both sense of what the mainstream values and attitudes are, and creating this emotional reaction, right, is the media. The media are at the heart of making all of this work. So what we find in the sort of the social science behind the book, right, through lots and lots of surveys that we ran, was that it was the process of reading about the news, political news in particular, and international relations as well, reading about it, watching it on television, listening to it on the radio, experiencing it in that media space, and then talking about it with other people, right? That's what, first of all, creates this sense of what mainstream views and attitudes are, creates that adherence to it, and it creates this emotional response. So the role that the media are playing is incredibly important. But it's a little bit different than the way that most political scientists think about the news, and think about why we read the news and consume the news to begin with. If you study political science in any of your courses, right, media shows up, right? In the stories that people are telling, right? But it shows up in a process of what I'm calling here rational preference formation, right? Which is the fancy way of saying, look, I need to make a decision at some point, right? So I'm going to go out and get information, and I'm going to use that information to decide what decision I'm going to make, right? So it might be an investment decision. Political scientists talk about this in terms of a voting decision. And political scientists imagine that, if you have an election coming up in 2 years and 4 years, right? There's an election coming up in this country in November, I'm told, right? And that means, right, from a political scientist point of view, that the reason I'm consuming all of this news is because I'm constantly thinking about who I'm going to vote for in November. Well, I'm not thinking about who I'm going to vote for in November, and most people aren't, right? The reason that most people consume the news, right, is a social reason. It's because we need to be able to have conversations with people in our lives, whether it's colleagues or family members or whoever else, friends, right? People we interact with on social media. We need to be able to interact with those people about what's happening in the world. And this is not just an authoritarian phenomenon. This is something we all do. And so the decisions that I'm going to make about which media I'm going to consume, whether I live in an authoritarian system or whether I live in a democracy, are not only going to be, and maybe not even ever going to be guided by my sense of how reliable this media is as a source of accurate information, but by how this particular media outlet connects me to my social circle. Right? So if I take another American example, if I, as I am, right, surrounded in most of my life by people who get their news from National Public Radio and the New York Times, I'm not going to sit down at the dinner table and say, I heard this really interesting thing from Tucker Carlson today, right? That's going to put me immediately on the outside of my social circle. That's not someplace that I want to be, unless I really want to be provocative. And there are some people who like comedy, right? Not me, and not most people, it turns out. Right. So there's a very powerful social incentive that reinforces all of these other things that make authoritarianism work, to be consuming the media that everybody else around me is consuming. So this is the background. This is trying to get into thinking about, well, what happens how does repression work in the media sector? What happens when governments make censorship decisions? Right. So I'm drawing here. I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about sort of all the nuts and bolts behind it, but I was able to run some surveys both in Belarus in 2020, 2021. Right. The first one came out where we actually were in the field just after after Lukashenko claimed his 80-something% election victory, right, which provoked a rather massive series of protests. We repeated that again in 2021, and then another one in another series in Russia in 2019, 2020, basically before and after the constitutional referendum in 2020, right? And Belarus and Russia are different. We often think of them as being very similar, right? But up until, again, very, very recently, and we can talk about that towards the end, up until very, very recently, we would have generally thought of Belarus as more of a fear dictatorship and Russia as more of a spin dictatorship. Belarus has had a consistently coercive approach to media control since Lukashenko came to power in 1994. It never privatized the media. Right? There were some private media that emerged, right? But it never went through the process that Russia did of selling off a lot of the media assets. Right? Putin eventually began to reconcentrate some of that, particularly television, into the state, actually fairly early on, right? In his term, but that was already 10 or 11 years after independence, or after the end of the Soviet Union. Belarus, by contrast, maintained an official legal monopoly, like a constitutional monopoly, on broadcast media, right, on television and terrestrial television and radio. It strengthened that through media laws that essentially made it impossible for any independent media, including online media, to cover politics, with a very broad definition of what politics means, right? So anything basically that could ever possibly shift public opinion, right, ended up beyond the pale, with very real jail sentences for anybody who would criticize the state or public officials. Whereas Russia pursued, with again the partial exception of television, where Putin really did go after the commanding heights of television very early on in his career. Russia has pursued this much more co-optive and persuasive approach to media control that did at least persist until late, well, maybe the middle of last year, exactly, where we would draw the death knell for that is an open question. So what we find in Russia, right, is that there's this, Russia begins to create a gray zone. So as the state decides that a particular media outlet is maybe becoming too problematic, right, too influential in terms of shifting public opinion in ways that the state is not happy with, begins to undermine this idea of the leaders as legitimate and competent. Right, number of examples of this. Right, so one of the newspapers popular among sort of the business elite, RBK, right, in, if I remember the year, I think it's 2019, maybe 2018, publishes a series of investigations into Putin's daughters, right, and some of their business dealings. Right, within a couple of weeks, the entirety of that of the ownership structure is shifted to new hands. Right, the new hands come in, explain to the newsroom that, look, this is the reality in which we're working. You can cover lots of things, but you're not going to cover that. Right, so RBK moves from a zone of being fairly independent and reasonably challenging, right, into one that is now not servile to the state, right, but not willing to challenge certain core aspects of the state's message. Right, very similar things happen over time to Coercion, to Viedomosti, and to other influential newspapers and news sites in the Russian media system. At the same time, right, the system has certainly some voices that are very much pro-state and are full of propaganda, again, particularly on television, right, and others that are very much opposition, right. So others, particularly online, places like TV Rain, Dozht, right, Echo Moskvy to an extent, right, Meduza, some of these other news websites, right, Media Zona, that are much more openly and overtly oppositional, right. But it's this gray zone, right, that over the time, at least in the survey, that seems to be gathering an increasing amount of media attention, and we see, in fact, that the independent space shrinking over time, right, and people who do consume mostly independent media, right, reading fewer and fewer sources, in part because there are fewer and fewer independent sources for them to read. Pressure does push some of these groups out of existence. Right? And the Viedomosti case, I mentioned that a moment ago. So Viedomosti, originally this business newspaper, right, set up as a joint venture of the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times in the late 1990s, had been a leading voice of independent journalism, right, and eventually, actually, just in between these two surveys, right? So in 2020, the government basically encourages the leadership or the ownership of this newspaper to transfer it to other hands, right? And it becomes, again, part of this gray zone. What happens, though, is that people who had been Viedomosti readers, right, we see this in the survey, stay with Viedomosti, right? So they retain a degree of brand loyalty, right? And they don't move off to these independent media, the more oppositional media. Very different picture in Belarus, right? There has really, for 2 decades now, never really been any middle ground between state and opposition media. Opposition media operate exclusively online, mostly underground, and under a tremendous amount of pressure from the state. And what we've seen consistently over time is that there's in fact been a growing demand, right, for consumption of independent media, And there has, at least until 2020, right, been a growing number of independent media outlets for people to consume. Right? So you have a number of websites, you've got Telegram channels, you've got online broadcasters, others often operating from outside the country, so from Lithuania or from Poland, but effectively projecting messages, often through VPNs and other kinds of technology, right, into the country itself. So another thing that happens between the two rounds of the surveys is that the state decides it's going to go after the leading independent news site in Belarus, an organization called Tutby. They do this with a very heavy, coercive, kind of fear dictator hand, right? It's not about transferring ownership. It's about blocking access to the servers and blocking access to the VPNs that people are using to access the servers and arresting everybody they can get their hands on. Not the only internet site that goes through this. There was the famous case of Roman Protasevich, who was flying from Greece to Lithuania. The plane made the mistake of flying over Belarusian airspace. It was forced down by the Belarusian Air Force, and he was arrested in the airport in Minsk. Right. What we've seen as a result of this is that people stick with their political loyalties when faced with the loss of access to a media outlet like Tutby, right? So people who had been Tutby readers don't all of a sudden go and start consuming the messages that the state wants them to consume. They don't all of a sudden start watching Belarusian state television. They go and they look for other oppositional sources of media. And as a result, over time, we have this really broadening polarization of media audiences, right? So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, it's a little hard to see up on the screen. I'm happy to share the slides instantly if anybody wants to take a closer look. And there is a policy paper that's about to be published about all of this if you want to read it. But what we see essentially, right, is that particularly for those people who prefer independent media, those whose social circles are pushing them in that direction. And in Belarus, that actually turns out to be the majority of the people who respond to the survey, the majority of the population. Right? They don't watch any state media. They're not interested almost at all, right, in any of the state messaging. It was very highly polarized environment, again, in this highly coercive system. Right? Whereas in Russia, we have much more overlap. Right? What we find is that even people, media diets essentially, of people who prefer independent media, right, who aren't sort of beholden to the messages coming from Russian state television, right, actually overlap tremendously, right, with state media. What this essentially means is that in Belarus, in this very coercive environment, you have not just competing media and competing media systems, right, but you have totally competing informational landscapes. You have one group of people consuming one set of media, right, living in a world with one informational agenda. Right? So it talks about the pandemic. It talks about the elections. It talks about protests. It talks about things happening in the economy. And then you have the state media that doesn't. Right? The pandemic's not happening. It's happening there, right, overseas somewhere, but it's not happening in Belarus, right? The elections came and went. Lukashenko obviously won with 70% of the vote. Don't need to talk about that anymore. Everything in the economy is wonderful, right? So it's not just polarized in terms of what people are reading in terms of sources of information. It's actually polarized in terms of the actual content of that information, right? Whereas what we see in Russia, right, or what we used to see in Russia until very recently, was something very different. The information agenda, the news that was being covered in state and independent media, and including these sort of gray zone media, are broadly the same. They're talking about the pandemic. They're talking about the state of the economy. They're talking about the state of politics, with some exceptions. You still can't mention Navalny if you're on state television, right? But it's the interpretations that differ. It's the spin that differs. as a result of which, right, if you are a dictator, right, which of these pictures would you rather be in? Throw that up to the room. Why?
Because you can direct how people interpret and understand it rather than polarizing half of the population.
Right. If I'm a spin dictator, if I'm Putin, right, in this picture, at least in 2020, right, I'm pretty happy, because even people who really would prefer not to get that much state media, right, whose social circles are pulling them towards these more independent media, they're getting a lot of my message. If I'm Lukashenko, I'm not getting anything through. I'm getting something through to the people who are loyal to me, right, for whatever reason. But that's a shrinking group of people, right? And I've got no way of getting any traction, right, of ever persuading, ever changing the views other than through use of force, right, of people on the other side of the political divide, right? So cooptation does look like it's a more effective strategy of media control, right? But that's not the way the world is moving, certainly not the way Russia is moving. And I think if we look at other places, including in China, for example, which has straddled this line for some period of time, but has moved much further back in the coercive direction. Places like Myanmar, potentially places like Hungary, places like Turkey, places like India under Modi or Brazil under Bolsonaro, right? We're seeing much more coercion. We're seeing that dictators, for whatever reason, right, are beginning to think that this sort of approach to spin and persuasion and cooptation maybe isn't delivering everything that they need to. I don't really understand why. I have to have a conversation about that, right? But they're moving in this direction that seems to be less effective, right? And that in fact leads to having less traction, right? Leads to much more polarization. So if I had to make a prediction about Russia's future, right, instead Russia's future begins to look a whole lot more like Belarus after what we've seen in the last few months. Right? Obviously, this has picked up pace since the war began. Right? We've seen the closure of outlets like Dozhd and Echo Moskvy. We've seen fairly successful attempts to make it to limit people's access to online social media, Facebook and Twitter, to a certain extent YouTube. Right? We've seen a lot more coercion, right, and violence, frankly, in suppressing certain kinds of messages with the introduction of laws and imposing jail sentences of up to 15 years for calling the war a war. Right? This is stuff that you're all aware of. From a rational choice perspective, right? Putin shouldn't be doing that. It's a bad idea, right? It's going to take him in a place that he doesn't want to be. Then again, from a rational choice perspective, the war was a bad idea. So there we are. I'm going to stop there, and having probably gone way over time, and open it up for discussion. And thank you for your patience.
Let's clap for someone.